It is often said that attack is the best form of defense. However, I think that's wrong. The best defense would be the self-destruction of your opponent, where your opponent defeats himself without you having to make any offensive or defensive efforts. This ideal is what the Van Tilian school of apologetics strives towards. There's no running away from it. The apologetic encounter between the Christian and unbeliever can be seen as a battle between two diametrically opposed ideas. Usually, the Christian is on the receiving end of the unbeliever's intellectual challenges and attacks. Apologetics is literally defined as a rational defense of the Christian faith. The Christian defends the intellectual integrity of his faith, trying to answer the objections raised by the unbeliever. Sometimes the Christian goes on the offensive. He tries to prove the truth of Christianity or establish its rationality. He could even try to undermine the unbeliever's own views. But what if the Christian position was so unassailable that any attempt to attack it ends in self-destruction? This is what the Van Tilians believe to be the case. The proposition is that denying Christianity is like pressing the self-destruct button on one's worldview. Whatever weapons the unbeliever brings to the battle against Christianity are, unbeknownst to him, pointed towards his own camp. Put another way, the denial of Christianity is self-defeating. And the reason for this is simple. Objecting to, arguing against, and ultimately denying Christianity all presuppose certain things about the nature of reality, man, and the world. And these presuppositions, in turn, presuppose a broadly Christian view of the world. This is the crux of the so-called transcendental argument for Christianity. What the Van Tilian is saying in essence is that in order to challenge the truth of Christianity and the gospel, the world must be a certain way. And it is only Christianity that teaches that the world is that way. Therefore, to reject Christianity is to affirm it. In other words, it is the self-defeating endeavor. And there is no better illustration of this than the case of logic. To argue against Christianity or to raise any reasonable objection to it, one must make use of logic, be it formal logical arguments, logical principles, logically coherent expressions, or rules of inference. The very possibility of the apologetic encounter presupposes our possession of logical concepts, our knowledge of logical truths, and the application of those truths to human experience. Therefore, if these things presuppose a Christian view of the world, that shows that all arguments against Christianity are self-defeating. The purpose of this video then is to demonstrate that logical knowledge in particular presupposes the existence of God and the truth of Christianity, and in doing so demonstrate the futility of any attempt to philosophically or intellectually undermine the Christian faith. So without further ado, let us jump right into it. The first thing we have to figure out is exactly what we mean by logical knowledge. Well, that's easy. It simply means knowledge of logical truths. But the next question arises, that is, what exactly is a logical truth? Wikipedia provides a helpful definition. It says, broadly speaking, a logical truth is a statement which is true regardless of the truth or falsity of its constituent propositions. In other words, a logical truth is a statement which is not only true, but one which is true under all interpretations of its logical components. This is a fancy way of saying that a logical truth is a statement that is true independent of context. Standard examples of logical truths are the classical laws of logic. The law of identity, for example, which states that A is A. It does not matter what proposition one substitutes for A. It is always true that A is A. Logical truths form the foundation of all logical systems and therefore, form the basis for all logical reasoning and argumentation. To make rational arguments or inferences, we must know at least some logical truths. Now that we know what logical truths are and how important our knowledge of them is to our ability to argue rationally, the next question is an epistemological one. How do we gain knowledge of logical truths? Now, this is a question that has been pondered by philosophers throughout the ages. These truths seem so fundamental to our cognitive experience, therefore, it is imperative that we come up with some account of our knowledge of them. Answering the question of how we come to gain knowledge of logical truths requires us to deeply consider how we know anything at all. It has been standard procedure in philosophical discourse to divide things we know into two categories: knowledge gained through experience and knowledge gained apart from experience. The first category is usually referred to as a posteriori knowledge, and the second category is referred to as a priori knowledge. If we think about it, any knowledge we have can be placed into either one of these categories. So it seems that the answer to the question of how we know logical truths would be limited to one of these. But there is another way to categorize human knowledge, and this is the categorization of analytical knowledge and synthetic knowledge. Although this categorization is very similar to the a priori, a posteriori distinction, there is a minor difference. Here, the focus is on the relationship between the subject of knowledge, that is, the knower, and the object of knowledge, in other words, the thing that is known. By way of definition, we can say that analytical knowledge is knowledge that is gained without reference to something that exists apart from the subject of knowledge. Synthetic knowledge, on the other hand, is simply the negation of analytical knowledge. That is, it is knowledge gained with reference to something that exists apart from the subject of knowledge. To put it simply, if the subject and object of knowledge are independent of each other, then knowledge is synthetic. However, if the object of knowledge is wholly dependent on the subject, then knowledge is analytic. An example of analytic knowledge would be an author's knowledge of his characters or facts about his story's world. If you ask an author the gender of his main character, his answer would not depend upon an investigation of some independent source. Rather, because every fact about the character is dependent on him, he simply needs to consult his own mind and his own conception of the character. His knowledge of facts about his characters is analytic because it does not depend on anything that exists independently of him. Most knowledge we have, however, falls into the category of synthetic knowledge. This is because, for most things, our knowledge of them requires us to reference or investigate or experience things that are independent of us. If someone were to ask me how many grains are in a particular bag of rice, pure analysis would never give me the right answer. I can't just consult my own mind to know how many grains are in the bag. In order to know how many grains are in the bag of rice, I must actually count. In other words, I must actually experience or investigate something that is independent of my mind. This is the difference between analysis and synthesis, or between analytic knowledge and synthetic knowledge. For any knowledge we have, that knowledge is either analytic or synthetic. So that means that our knowledge of logical truths is either analytic or synthetic. But this is where some problems start to arise. First, let us consider the position that knowledge of logical truths is synthetic in nature. This would mean that the objects of knowledge, which are the logical truths in this case, are independent of the subject of knowledge, which refers to us. What is the implication of such a position? Well, as we have observed, to gain synthetic knowledge of a thing, we must experience or investigate that thing. But what happens when the object of knowledge is a universal truth or a generality? Universal truths or generalities are propositions that can be true of multiple individuals or objects. For example, one can say, Jerry is a shy person, and that may be true. And if it is true about that particular person named Jerry. However, if one were to claim every person named Jerry is shy by nature, that ceases to be a claim about a particular person. If it is true not just of a particular person, but of multiple individuals. In that sense, it is a universal truth or a generality. There are numerous examples of universal principles. Scientific laws are a clear example. The second law of thermodynamics is not just true of a particular closed system, it is true of every closed system that exists in our universe. Universal truths have been called many names. Some call them generalities, some call them regularities, some call them laws. The important thing is that we recognize that we can have multiple instances of their truth. And an interesting implication of this is that such truths transcend time and space. By that, I mean that their truth is not limited by time period or spatial location. The second law of thermodynamics isn't just true at one point in time or at a particular point in space. It is true at all times and in all places. An interesting question that we can consider is whether one can have synthetic knowledge of universal truths. Since universal truths cannot be confined to a particular location or time period, the only way to gain synthetic knowledge of them is by experiencing or investigating every particular instance of their truth. In other words, synthetic knowledge of universal truths requires universal experience. Now, upon closer inspection, we can see that logical truths are universal in nature. From the definition we gave earlier, we learned that logical truths are true regardless of whatever proposition we slot into them. This means that logical truths are not just true of particular propositions. They are true of all propositions that fall within their scope. And this makes sense. It is a logical truth that every proposition has the opposite truth value of its negation. This is the case for any proposition, and it is the case at any time and at any place. Therefore, it is a universal truth. The problem then is that it is impossible to have synthetic knowledge of logical truths. No human has universal experience. No finite being can verify that a logical truth holds at all times and at all places. One might object that even though we may not be able to verify its truth in every instance, our finite experience still grants us confirmation of its truth in multiple instances. The problem with this is that it renders logic useless outside the domain of human experience. If the universality of logical truths cannot be verified, then how do we know that they will be true in the future, or in parts of the universe which we have not experienced? In essence, without universality, logical truths become useless in granting us knowledge of reality. If synthetic knowledge of logical truths is impossible, then perhaps our knowledge of logical truths is analytic in nature. If our logical knowledge is analytic, that implies that logical truths are dependent on the human mind, and therefore it can be known purely apart from any experience or investigation of a mind-independent reality. However, here we run into a different problem, and that is the separation of our logical systems from the external world. Simply put, there is no reason why the external mind-independent world should conform to the logical truths produced by our minds. For all we know, the external world is filled with facts that cannot be logically manipulated. Whatever logical truths we come up with through our a priori analysis would literally be figments of our imagination. There would be no way to impose those truths on the world, and there would be no way to confirm that those truths actually apply to the world out there. A world where there are true contradictions or where modus ponens is an invalid form of inference would render our logical truths useless. If you want to object that such a world is impossible, you would be presupposing that logical possibility, which in this case is wholly dependent on the rational activity of our minds, determines the nature of external reality. But there really is no reason to think that the external world must be logically possible. The human mind cannot legislate or determine what reality must be like. This is because humans have no power over the nature of reality or the nature of the facts that are instantiated therein. Once again, logical truths become useless in granting knowledge of reality. So it seems that neither synthesis nor analysis can properly account for human knowledge of logical truths. What then is the alternative? Well, the only alternative is to reject an assumption that we have made throughout our analysis so far, and that is the assumption of epistemological autonomy. Throughout our analysis, we have left God out of the equation. Contrary to what many may think, whether or not an epistemological scheme includes a Christian God has significant implications for the ability of such a scheme to consistently account for human knowledge, and that can be clearly seen in the case of logical truths. We have seen that the two possible avenues for accounting for human knowledge of logical truths, analysis and synthesis, are riddled with problems. These problems all disappear given a Christian epistemology, though. Given the Christian understanding of reality, a sovereign God exists and has created the world and everything in it. This God also created the mind of man and designed it to reflect his own mind, albeit on an inferior creaturely level. This God also exhaustively determines every fact that occurs in the temporal series we call history. Given this understanding, logical truths are simply a reflection of the mind of God, and human knowledge of logical truths is secured on the basis of divine revelation. To put it simply, we can know logical truths because God reveals them to us. This sidesteps the issues with both analytic and synthetic knowledge. Because logical truths do not depend on the human mind but rather on God, there are no issues with securing the applicability of logic to the external world. This is because God, unlike man, has the power to impose his thoughts and his conceptual categories on the world. Since he is in control of all that happens in the world, he can ensure that the facts in the mind-independent world actually conform to our logical systems and can actually be logically manipulated using the logical truths he has revealed to us. There is also no problem concerning the universality of logical truths, since we are not reliant on having universal experience in order to justify these truths. Through revelation, we can have knowledge of universal logical truths prior to experience, and we can be assured of the universality of these truths even though we do not have universal experience. Since divine revelation is God literally sharing some of his knowledge with us, we have access to the perspective of a being for whom there is no mystery. This assures us that our logical truths will not be subject to refutation by future facts which we have not yet experienced. Although brief, I have outlined how a Christian understanding of reality can consistently account for human knowledge of logical truths. It is important to note that I am not saying that God directly reveals the correct set of logical truths to us. I am not saying that God directly reveals that, for example, modus ponens is a valid form of inference. There is an ongoing debate in philosophical circles surrounding the correct logical system. I am not claiming that divine revelation settles this debate. The claim is that divine revelation, more specifically general revelation, provides the human mind with broadly fundamental logical concepts, categories, and structures. These categories enable the human mind to think logically. In essence, the argument isn't about particular logical systems, but rather logic in general. Whatever system of logic one thinks is correct, be it classical, paraconsistent, relative, or whatever, that logical system would have some logical truths, which are built on fundamental logical concepts and categories. The account I've given is about how knowledge of logical truths can be possible, regardless of what one thinks these logical truths are. With that out of the way, I think it is clear that only a Christian understanding of reality has any chance of successfully accounting for human knowledge of logical truths. And this entails that any argument against Christianity is necessarily self defeating. To argue against Christianity or rationally object to Christianity, one must rely on logical knowledge. But since logical knowledge presupposes the truth of Christianity, arguing against Christianity is inherently self defeating.